Hi, I'm Martin Rust with the Security and Policy Institute for Professional Development here at the University of Ottawa. My guest today is Scott Gilmore, a former diplomat and current columnist with Maclean's Magazine. Talking about a variety of issues today, Scott, but one of them, of course, is our own country here at home. How do we build a better Canada? What kind of policy issues do we need to explore? And how do we prepare, essentially, for the future in a geopolitical and global environment?
Well, one of the issues that I have spent some time thinking about is not necessarily how we make policy, but who are the policymakers. One of the things I've noticed about Canada in my work with the Canadian Public Service, but also with my work with Americans and British and Australian governments, is how siloed we are here. The Canadian public servants, for the most part, are public servants. Their entire career has been spent in that stream, and they'll retire out of it. It's very rare for people to come in from the private sector, from academia, or from the nonprofit sector, which is what you see happen much, much more frequently in the UK and in the United States, for example. And I think this dramatically reduces the quality of the policy making that we have. It creates a disconnect with the civil society and with the private sector that's necessary for us to understand what's happening, where it's going, and what we need to do to take advantage of that.
So how do we change that?
Well, there's some very simple things that could be done. Unfortunately, they involve unions and the Treasury Board that would allow people to move in and out more freely. There are more complex things in terms of our culture around this. Right now, we're very, very suspicious of anybody from the private sector coming in, and we're very, and particularly anybody from the political class coming into the civil service. I think we need to get past that. But there are examples that we can learn from, very practical ones, and how they do things in Washington and Canberra and London.
I'm wondering if there are specific policy areas that lend themselves more to attracting a wider pool of talent, and what those might be. Well,
from my observation, on the trade and commerce side, you do see a little bit more interchange taking place, or exchange between the public and the private sector. I find, though, on the more classical foreign policy side, that it's shocking how little movement there is back and forth. And it's bad for both sides. Canada's just hopefully ended over a decade of war in Afghanistan. I can't think of any academics in Canada who could justifiably call themselves Afghan experts, who had spent time inside government on Afghan issues or with the Department of Defense, who spoke Dari or Pashto, who had spent time on the ground. And that's partly a question of funding for universities, but it's also because we're just not allowing that movement back and forth.
If we accept the premise that what happens in the rest of the world impacts Canada and Canadian policy, and what you're talking about is a gap, therefore, of international experts. The question is short-term and long-term. What do we do short-term, and if there's a particular area of focus, what do we focus on?
Well, short-term, I would propose what on the surface would seem to be a fairly bold and ridiculous policy move, but I think could be practical, which is incentives to allow Canadian university students to study for one semester abroad, anywhere they wanted. I think it could be financed, and I think the returns over the long term would be would be significant for Canada. We really are a stay-at-home nation. We tend to vacation in Mexico and occasionally in Europe. And even though we have this incredibly multi-ethnic, multinational country, it's very rare for people to do business in Beijing, or have friends in South America, or have traveled in South Asia, and we need to change that. In the longer term, I think we have to recognize that the world is changing, and that places like Africa are becoming more and more important. Nigeria, for example, is going to have a larger population than the United States by the turn of the mid-century. And not only that, Africa in general is going to have a larger middle class than China. Now, these are facts that should be ringing in the halls at Foreign Affairs and the Department of Trade, but I'm afraid they're not getting the attention they deserve.
Well, that's why the Security and Policy Institute was created. That's why we're here, and so that's why discussions like this today are so important. Thank you. I'm Martin Rust with the Security and Policy Institute for Professional Development here at the University of Ottawa. My guest today has been Scott Gilmore, a former diplomat and current columnist with Maclean's Magazine. Thank you.
Thank you.